You know, I'm sort of prepared, but I'm sort of not prepared. I've never really had an organized a situation as this in which to explain what I do or what I'm thinking about. And I want to talk about what I'm doing, but I also really want to talk about what I'm thinking, because I haven't yet come to the conclusion, because I'm on the process of doing something that is evolving. So the first thing I should say is that I'm delighted to be here. It's really nice to see a full house. I've often talked to a very unfull house. And last night when I said, well, you know, who else am I talking with? I got a list, and it was over dinner. And the list was the empathy woman, the Twitter people, the French architects, the New Yorker arts woman, the silent noises person, the camera eye guy, the 3D prosthetics, the British security guy, the drone person, the iPhone guru kid, who we just had, the Natural History Museum, the financial crisis professor, who is Darwinian, the amputee snowboarder, the Chicada phenomenist filmmaker, and the face transplanter. And so I thought to myself, you know, well, I don't really fit in, and I don't really have any qualifications, but you could call me the museum guy. I mean, but it's not really true, because my project is really an accident. I'm an accidental museum founder. I don't even really call myself a museum director. I borrowed the name from somebody who has the same name as me, which is Brett, which was a sign from God. And I was quite interested in that because I was looking at signs of God and putting them in the museum. If that's confusing, what I should do is show you a couple of minutes of the last thing we did until I started to think a bit more. And this was last year, and this is a short film from the Venice Biennale, which was very related to the things that I do. So if we could play the film.
It's a real problem with the word artist. If you name any other field, you're just defining the field. Once you say you're an artist, you're already approving what you do.
The thing that I think we look for in art is a kind of urgency, like the artist could not help but do it.
The idea of actually making, because you're actually still every day trying to figure out something, seems to be sort of almost unacceptable.
It's this idiotic thing that you think something is missing, and the thing that is missing I have to do.
People constantly say to me, they kind of associate me because I make things with crazy behavior.
Yes, absolutely.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Why is that?
In the art world, we're always interested in like going further in the knowledge, in the margin.
The things that are happening in the gray area that we can't quite classify or quantify have always been most interesting to me.
So he's trying to define a very genuine original practice. So you know who is in the center of this definition? Outsider artists.
They don't know who Warhol is, who Liechtenstein is, they don't know who Renoir is.
What kind of discourse can we develop around these other artists that are not part of the canon?
We really need to open up a new language to define what is to come.
I find the term outsider art just...
Well, it's terrible.
It's a terrible term.
People have said to me it's exoticism. It's choosing something
I love
completely
exoticism.
different.
I mean, what is this? Why do we fight all the time against exoticism? It's fantastic.
The borders are not down at all around the word outsider. On the contrary, the art world is about to mount a counteraction and to try to toughen up this border. People will now try to define the term again.
They did miss the last question before he squawks, which is, I asked him, you know, is there such a thing as an outsider artist? And that was his answer. But I'm going to attempt in the time I've got to take you through the ideas that I'm thinking about. And, you know, it all begins, really, I'm quite an existential person. I've been like that since I was quite young. I want to know the meaning why. I used to read Kafka. My father used to tell me off. He said, you'll go crazy. He was right. So I think the real starting point to talk about art, which is what those people are discussing, is where it comes from. And I think it comes from the beginning of time. I think that creationism is correct. Here's the earth. Here's what was created, and here we are. And I don't know, I've been thinking about that a lot because, you know, the art that we show at the Museum of Everything is not art that's called art by most institutions or museum directors or exhibitors, and hasn't been for many years, apart from certain places where it's come in through the sides. And I wonder why that is, because I think about the word art and what it means, and I realize it's sort of a bit of a construct, because if that's our first moment, we were living in the caves, and that's what we were doing on the walls. And that's a very beautiful image that I think is from the caves in Chaume in France. It looks a lot like this, which is a painting by Gerhard Richter, who's, you know, a very celebrated 20th century artist and 21st. And we painted this, which looks a lot like this, which is by Picasso. And then this, and why are we doing these things? Why were people making these things at the earliest point? It wasn't to go to an art fair. It wasn't to have a show at the Gagosian Gallery. It wasn't to be celebrated and travel around the world. That, by the way, let's have a look. That one looks like this, which is Louise Bourgeois. There she is on one side. That's the painter of the other one on the other side. And, of course, he's unknown. Now, I'm not saying that we're back to the caveman again, but I'm saying that somehow we've lost something in between going from here to here. I mean, if you go around the world, museums and galleries will tell you that this is a neutral environment in which to look at art. That can't be correct. That doesn't exist except in Greenland. So when I was starting to look at a certain kind of art form, and I wondered how to exhibit it, which I hadn't thought about doing when I was looking at it, I thought that's not really right. And I thought back to this, because the caveman is looking at the same kind of things, he's making the art, and the reasons are simple. He wants to communicate to people, to girls, which is still true in the art world. You can meet a lot of girls by making art. Artists are always getting laid. And, you know, people throughout the ages love art. I mean, doesn't matter who they are, museums are set up for people to admire and worship art. And they come in their droves, and over the 20th century, the museum really became a place to worship. And that's not very surprising, because something like this, which is the Guggenheim, which is a fantastic museum, does look a bit like this. And there's a reason for that, which is to do with the history of art, of which I know absolutely nothing. I have to tell you, I didn't study art. I come from film. It's not my thing. And maybe that's what gave me the ability to start thinking that these cathedrals, which were palaces, were not quite correct. So the real question is why we create and what we create. And I have made some notes here. And I think it's to do with what is art, where it's from, is the cave a studio, is it a gallery, and what do we expect when we go to look at something? Now, a long time ago, there was a big separation of art, when art was defined. And in every culture, they split the high, and this is a great example of high art, and the low. That's low art. It's sort of crap. So they push it aside, and they say this is not art, because art is actually this one. And everybody says yes, and we go back to these places to go and look at it. And I guess I got very interested in this kind of material and wondered what it was about. And the more I looked, the more I saw. And, you know, the first speaker today really impressed me because she talked about empathy. And I found that I had a lot more personal empathy for this carved stick than for this. I don't relate to that. I don't know what that's about. I need too much information about the history of art in order to really appreciate it, although the detail is magnificent. But this. So I studied a bit more and found out that there was a history of people looking at the low arts since time began. This is a doctor called Morgenthaler. Now, he celebrated this man. This man was a convicted pedophile. But while he was in the hospital, he started to create an enormous body of work. And the doctor realized that actually these weren't symptoms. Perhaps this was art. Perhaps this was something else, something being created privately for that man. Now, there's a history in the 20th century of this kind of art. And it did eventually get limelight through this man. This man is Jean de Buffet. He was a wine merchant, and he created something called art brut. And in art brut enclosed all kind of people who are self-taught, who are making stuff privately for themselves. And he gave them a name because he felt they shouldn't be an art. He wanted somehow to separate them. Now, his reasons are quite complicated. I won't go into them. But I will say that I think that's where he got the name from. And nobody has ever said it. Because he was a wine merchant, and I'm sure one day, a little drunk, that's where he said, Ruinart Brut. Over in America, something else was happening. This is Alfred Barr. Alfred Barr was the director of the Museum of Modern Art. Now, he believed in two histories of art, the main history and the parallel history. This is an example of the parallel history. This is a 50-year-old black man who was uneducated and lived in Tennessee, where he was making these carvings out of limestone just for himself or to go on gravestones. He was seen by a fashion photographer who then introduced him to Alfred Barr, who put him in the museum, and which is why in 1936 this man had a show in the Museum of Modern Art. But nobody knows because he was a black man in 1936. Another champion was this man, who's called Sidney Janis. He celebrated Morris Hirschfeld, who was also taught himself, was a slipper manufacturer, and they called them the primitives, or naive, or folk. And these are the names that they gave to these people. And this name really bothered me. I didn't like this name, because it suggests people who are less, that somehow the making of something personal and private is not as important as the high art. And that was the word that came up again and again, that these people were insane. And I started to think about how I felt about the material. And I think that summed it up for me. I didn't believe the words, which is why I called it the Museum of Everything. So let me show you a few of the artists that we have in the museum. This is Bill Traylor. He was a slave who made his drawings on the side of the street. This is Henry Darger. Henry Darger created a fictional fantasy which was actually his life story, and he made it in the privacy of his bedroom and discovered only on his death. That's Henry Darger. This is Charles Delschau, a Prussian butcher making flying machines that he imagines will take him to another world. Aloise Corbage makes these beautiful images in books. They're princesses being saved by princes. This is her. She was living as a schizophrenic in an asylum. And this is a local artist. This is Willem van Genk, fantastic artist who also had schizophrenia and was obsessed by transport and the transportation here in Amsterdam. He had hundreds of these trolley buses all over his apartment. And as we look at these kind of artists, you see that something's going on, something very different about why they're making it. This is William Brett. This is the man who gave me his idea, and that's his original Museum of Everything. It's filled with all the stuff of his life. And it inspired me, so I thought, okay, that's how we're going to make our museum. So I opened in an old building in London, and we started curating as if I was curating in my own house, just all over the place. And I would make a journey and try and put things in alternative places. And what was interesting about it is during the journey, people started to respond. And I hadn't expected that. We meant to open for 2 weeks. And suddenly a 2-week project became 2 months. We had 35,000 people came, and we traveled to Italy, and another 40,000 came. And I think what they were responding to was that we were creating an environment, a world in which to kind of connect to art that had somehow been dismissed by mainstream society. And when I say dismissed, major museums don't consider this work art. When we've had the opportunity to introduce it in, for example, the Tate Modern in London, they've said, no, it's not what we look at. It's not art. It's one of those funny names, and it deserves its own special place. And that makes me think back to the cave, of course. Then, about a year later, I started to think, well, it can't just be these sort of known people. There must be people all over the world doing this. So I tried out a test in London, and I advertised for people. I said, do you make things in private? Are you a person who has a secret art practice? And people came, hundreds of people came to the Tate Modern, and we discovered all their work. It was fascinating. And so I thought, well, let's travel this. What happens if we take it across the world? I managed to find some Russians who said they'd do it. I found Mr. Abramovich and his girlfriend. And they said, sure, we'll travel from one side of the country to the other. So I based my poster on the Black Panthers, which I thought was appropriate. And then we took a traveling exhibition. We went right around the country, interviewing people, looking for artists. 100 people a day. It was exhausting, but we found phenomenal things. I'd love to tell you each story, but I can see the timer counting down. And the end show after 5 cities was here in Gorky Park, which is Gorky Park. I mean, it's a big deal. Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of people came to see that show, and it totally split Russian society. Because in Russia, even more than in England, you're not an artist unless you have a certificate, unless you've been trained. That became a very difficult thing for them to comprehend. And inside, we installed the show, and we did it the same way as if we were in an old building. We tried to create empathy with the audience. We tried to create a modest surrounding so that you could connect to the work. And that's something we also did here. And this is the exhibition that really changed the way I thought about everything. This is Selfridges in London. It's the biggest department store in London. It's one of the big department stores of the world. And I managed to persuade them that we should do a little show. And it started with one window, and then another window. And eventually, that's a sort of conglomeration of all the windows along that street. We had every single one. And each one of these is an artist. And then we did the actual show. And so in the middle of the department store, we made this very unusual world, this apartment filled with unusual images, images people hadn't seen before. What was interesting was that these were the artists. They were all learning disabled, and they come from studios which exist all around the world for artists with learning disability. And the idea is that they give them the materials, and they might create. And in the middle of that show, we showed maybe the most famous of all, whose name is Judith Scott, who made these pieces of work without really knowing what art is. She just started to bind objects more and more. She couldn't speak, she couldn't hear. And we installed them inside this show here. Now that's Judith Scott. In about a year, she's having a solo show at the Brooklyn Museum of Modern Art. And that's the first time in America that a learning disabled adult has been considered an artist. Judith Scott tells me more about creativity than my father did telling me off for reading Kafka, because creativity seems to come from that kind of place. And what made me start to think was that maybe someone with a severe learning disability doesn't have a disability at all. They have an ability, they have a creative way to explain to us and to speak to us. These objects may not be artworks, they may be words, they may be stories. Art may be a preposterous notion in a very tight box, and these people who've been somehow sidetracked throughout history, whose work has been thrown away, are actually the key to understanding art. Because in a contemporary art world, where it's all about the object, where it's all about money, these ideas are sort of forgotten. And perhaps it became very clear to me here, and this is the Venice Biennale, which is the film I showed you at the beginning. We were invited to the Venice Biennale, but we were invited for a weird reason. It was this is called the Encyclopedic Palace. It sounds a bit like the Museum of Everything, and it sort of is. It's a concept that the curator, Massimiliano Gioni, used to bring all kinds of art into this year's Biennale. And the artists that he showed were the artists that we've been showing for only 4 years. And they were displayed in a much more formal setting. But the idea was slightly similar. He had been inspired, I believe, quite strongly by what we were doing, by the way we were showing it, to communicate it to a much wider audience, to say there are other ways to think about art. And that was last summer. And it was complicated for me. I wasn't quite sure how to deal with all these people, all looking at the kind of art that we'd had great success communicating, but here it was on just like an international scale. And people said to me, oh, you know, the outside has come in and now it's all a mess and, you know, this is the commercialization. But I didn't feel that was correct. So I sort of just think back to, you know, my key characters. And I think back to the cave. And I think back to this painting and why it's there and why we exist and why we make anything. And that's really my whole story. I mean, I'd love to tell you more in detail, but there are about 7 seconds left on my counter. anyone is welcome to come up and ask me. We're just wondering where to go next. Thanks.
James Brett. Thank you. Thank you very much, James. For us, you'll always be the museum guy.